Hello. Thanks so much for joining us tonight to celebrate the release of Dr. Alexis Conason's new book, The Diet-Free Revolution. I'm Maggie, the new events manager here at Flyleaf. And before we begin, if you have questions throughout the event, put them in the chat or in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and I'll ask them towards the end of the evening. And you can find out about all of our other virtual events by clicking on the link at the top of the screen. We are starting to schedule some in-person hybrid events for the fall, so please check out our full events calendar on the Flyleaf website. If you'd like to make a donation to Flyleaf to help us continue to bring great programs like these to you in the future, please click the donate button below our faces. If you'd like to support Flyleaf and tonight's authors, we have copies of The Diet-Free Revolution available for purchase. Just click the green button at the bottom of this page. You can also call Flyleaf to order over the phone, or if you're local to Chapel Hill, come visit us and shop our shelves. We're now open 7 days a week, although we're closed next Monday, July 12th, for our annual inventory. And now I'd like to welcome our authors for tonight's event. Dr. Alexis Conason is a clinical psychologist and eating disorder specialist in private practice in New York City. She is the founder of the Anti-Diet Plan, a weight-inclusive online mindful eating program. She was previously a research associate at the New York Nutrition Obesity Research Center in affiliation with Columbia University. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed journals. She is a frequent speaker at conferences, and she has been featured widely as an expert on the topics of mindful eating, body image, and diet culture in the media. You can find her on social media at The Anti-Diet Plan. A lifelong New Yorker, Conason lives in Manhattan with her husband and 2 daughters. Stella Fosse has been called the Pied Piper of erotic creativity. Her book, Aphrodite's Pen, The Power of Writing Erotica After Midlife, encourages women to write and share erotic stories as a fun way to push back on ageism and sexism. As a late bloomer, Stella writes about the pleasures and absurdities of arriving at the party just when other folks are packing up to go home. Her most recent book, The Erotic Pandemic Ball, tells fantasy tales about the love lives of women in a lockdown senior community. Look for Stella's new novel, Brilliant Charming Bastard, this fall. Stella hails from California and lives with her partner in North Carolina. She shares her writing as well as ideas and resources for empowering women past midlife at stellafosse.com. I'm now going to minimize myself so we can focus on the authors, but I'll pop back up a little bit in about 30 minutes to moderate those questions that y'all are going to post in the Q&A.
All right, thank you, Maggie. Thanks very much. I'm excited to be talking with Alexis Conason this evening, whose new book presents a program to help us challenge assumptions about weight and health, take agency over our bodies, get rid of shame, and reclaim the pleasure of food. And also push back on the diet industrial complex, a phrase that I find particularly compelling. And to see the diet industrial complex for what it is, an industry powered by its own failure. So, Alexis, again, I'm very glad to be here talking with you. I thought it might make sense to start with something about your story and your journey, from your childhood experiences through your early years in a more traditional bariatric approach, and then your consciousness raising process and coming into the kind of program that you've developed for us in your new book. Would you mind reading there's a paragraph near the beginning of your book about your mom and about early experiences around body and size that I'd really appreciate it if you could read.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Stella, for being here. Thank you, Flyleaf, for hosting us.
Mm-hmm.
I would be thrilled to read that passage. So it goes like this. While my mother rarely commented on my body directly, the scorn for her own body spoke louder than words. Bodies were objects to be wrestled into submission. Food was a substance to exert control over or to surrender yourself to. As a child, I discovered that eating helped me cope with my internal struggles. Food was my companion, a source of comfort and pleasure in bleak moments. But as adolescence brought unwanted curves and unsolicited attention, food also became the enemy. My body took the blame for my unhappiness, and I was convinced that if I could just get my body to conform, I could finally have the love and acceptance I craved. I found myself caught in a vicious cycle. The more I dieted, the more out of control I felt around food. The more I ate, the more I hated my body. And the more I despised my body, the more convinced I became that dieting was the answer. For nearly 2 decades, around and around I went.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a little bit about, some of my early experiences with food that I think, like so many of us, and I actually think it's an incredible sign of resilience when I hear this from my clients, as kids, when we're so powerless and there's so little in life that we control. I don't think it's uncommon to find that food is a source of comfort and something that you can, sometimes one of the few resources that's available to a child to try to take care of themselves when the grown-ups in their life aren't always doing the best job of that. But at the time, of course, I didn't see it as a sign of resilience. I saw it as a source of shame and something to change. And I really was caught in that cycle for decades of my life, and so caught in it that I went into the field of psychology with the intention of wanting to study, weight loss and become kind of help other people figure this out and, hopefully try to help myself solve the issue along the way. Although, at the time I was very much framing it in terms of solving the issue would be, how can I make my body smaller? How can I take up less space in the world? How can I, finally learn how to have the willpower and strength to stick to this diet and fix my body the way that I, was told I was supposed to. So I pursued things for a while from that very traditional weight normative model.
And then how did you progress toward, how did your perspective shift?
Yeah. So it was, sometimes it's like the simplest things, but it had literally never occurred to me that there was any other way to be other than to be on this diet cycle, because that's what I grew up with. That's what everyone around me seemed to be doing. And that's just what I had never questioned it. Like, it just had never occurred to me that there was anything else out there. And when, I made it all the way through my psychology doctoral level training, I did postdoc, never heard anything about alternative approaches. And thankfully, not long after I started my private practice, I attended a mindful eating workshop, which was unfortunately, like so much of mindful eating had really been corrupted by the diet industry and was this weight loss focused program, which again, at the time I thought was nothing wrong with that. But at that workshop were a number of people who were involved in the health at every size movement. And I remember having a conversation with one person who said something to me along the lines of like, well, but we know that dieting doesn't work. And I was like, what are you talking about? Of course, dieting works. It's working for everyone. We're told it's supposed to work. The fact that I can't work it is a problem with me, not a problem with dieting. And I didn't take it in right away, but it rattled around in there, this idea that like, maybe diets don't work. Maybe what I've been told to do, maybe I'm not the problem. Maybe the system is the problem. And I was seeing it in my clients too. Like, they were having the same struggles. The more that they dieted, the more out of control they felt with food, the more they blamed themselves, the more that they believed that dieting would be the solution, even though, it wasn't working. So it started to just make sense. And I do think that sometimes you have this moment where something shifts in your thinking and all of a sudden everything falls into place. And I was like, this makes so much more sense. This being like an anti-diet approach, recognizing the systems that are invested in us feeling badly about our bodies, looking at a different approach to health, like that health, if we want to improve health, we can look at health behaviors, which, like, again, totally rational. It makes much more sense to focus on changing behaviors than changing our body size, which is not a behavior. And then, I would say that over the years, there's so many layers to all of this, including, like learning more about weight stigma and intersectionality, and so many layers that I'm just still learning more about all the time.
Yeah, that's a great introduction to sort of the wider scope of your book. And one of the things that really struck me reading it was your emphasis on our bodies being amazing, even if they're not doing exactly what we think we want them to do, and that our bodies will take care of us if we let them. So you really shifted into a model of collaborating with our bodies, didn't you?
Yeah, well, because fighting against our bodies is not working.
Yeah.
That's one
Yeah.
thing I felt for myself really deeply, and I saw it in my clients too. Like, it's just exhausting to be fighting yourself all the time. And I really do believe that our bodies are incredible. Like, our bodies hold so much wisdom, and this idea that we have to overrule what our body's telling us, or somehow, fight against our body because, like, some diet doctor on TV thinks they know better than, our own internal wisdom. It's mind-blowing. And I think that when we can just find a way to make peace with ourselves and recognize that it is a process of collaboration, that we're on the same team as our bodies, we can work together with a shared goal of feeling the best that we can, both mentally and physically.
Yeah, yeah. And when we're fighting against our bodies, we rob ourselves of our power, and we rob ourselves of the pleasure associated with food. And I think a lot of what you're talking about is reclaiming our agency over our bodies, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. Because when we're spending all of our time, money, energy, resources, emotional resources, financial resources in trying to fight against our body, and also grappling with those deep feelings of shame that make us want to run and hide instead of fully engaging in the world, it does rob us of our agency, and it disempowers us, because we feel that we're not good enough. We believe the lies that diet culture tells us, that we're not valuable or not worthy unless our body looks a certain way. And we essentially, so many people, I think, kind of take themselves out of the game, or they're playing, halfway. And, it just, sometimes I think about what it would be like if we all devoted all of the time and energy and resources that we spent on dieting and put that through, like, the causes and things in our life that were most important, and put all of that energy and devotion. And I think that would be a real game changer.
It sure would. We could, a person could write a dissertation with the energy that they use on dieting, or learn to speak a new language, or support a cause that's important to them, that has a social justice implication. One of the things that really struck me about your book was, and this is aligned with what we were just talking about, is you talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I wondered if you could describe that concept a little bit for us, and then talk about how the diet culture keeps us stuck at a low level in that hierarchy.
Yeah, so Maslow's hierarchy of needs was something, it's kind of an old psychological theory I learned about in grad school. I think if you've taken like a Psych 101 class, you might have touched on this. But essentially, he was a psychologist who believed that we have different levels of needs that need to be met. And it's very hard to focus on our higher level needs when our basic needs are not being met. So basic needs, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, are, things like food, shelter, safety, health, like basic health. So when, for example, someone who is starving, or who is, doesn't have a place to live, like, they're not going to be thinking about, or they're not going to be thinking as much about some of these higher level needs, which are things like, I think, relationships and creativity and art, and self, at the very top is like self-actualization. And I think that diet culture in many ways keeps us caught at this base of the pyramid. Like, it keeps us caught in these basic needs, because we don't have a sense of security around food, in terms of, even if we logistically have access to food, we don't give it to ourselves. We keep ourselves in this cycle of, will I be allowed to eat? Will I allow myself to eat this? Will I not? This is good. This is bad. I should restrict. Sometimes going long periods of time, like actually like without eating very much, or believing that we're not going to have access to food, believing we won't be able to eat very much, and then kind of staying stuck in that last meal mentality. but it all keeps us focused on like our food and hunger, instead of being able to move towards the higher level needs of like relationships and community causes and social engagement, art and creativity. So I think that that's, it's another way that diet culture robs us of our agency and distracts us from, I think, for most people, like things that would be more important and more meaningful in their lives.
Yeah, yeah. And in some ways, it comes down to money, doesn't it? I mean, someone once said, no one ever made money on people accepting themselves, but there's a lot of money to be made, whether you're in the makeup industry or the diet industry, on the failure to accept ourselves. And that's combined with one of the things that really struck me in your book was your discussion of how that industry, which is so wealthy and does exert influence, how it's influenced government policy. Like, for example, the part about how the categorization of at what level of weight a person is considered to be obese or morbidly obese, how those categories were tightened without, it sounds like, without good scientific evidence for it. Can you talk about that a little bit? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, and this was where my years as a quote unquote obesity researcher really came in handy, because I got a little bit of an inside peek into some of the dynamics around this. But I think you can also find this information publicly, and we know that I think it was like in the mid 90s, there was a decision made to lower the cutoff for quote unquote obesity for the BMI categorizations of like overweight and obesity. So we hear a lot about how, I mean, it's so ridiculous. It's like comical if it wasn't actually true, but we hear so much about how the obesity rates have skyrocketed, in the past, several decades, but the criteria changed. So literally, it's not so much that people's weights have changed as much as like overnight, they classified a whole other group of people as meeting these categories. So they just kind of changed the benchmarks, and we continue to see this, that was several decades ago, but like, in 2013, the American Medical Association made the decision to classify obesity, and I'm using air quotes here because the term obesity is pretty stigmatizing, and it's something that I try to avoid using. But I will use the kind of medical language when talking about this. But the American Medical Association classified obesity as a disease. And this was a really unusual decision because it went against their advisory board, which was a group that they had convened to try to, just share the science and the data on what was, whether this decision should be made to classify it as a disease. And their advisory board said the evidence wasn't there to support that it's a disease. It's a body size. It's not, it doesn't meet its own criteria for a disease. And it was a really unusual decision that they rejected the findings of their advisory board. And if you look at the people who were making those decisions in the AMA and the people who were kind of involved in some of the other study groups, they all had really deep ties to the weight loss industry. There were people on there who were consultants to the pharmaceutical industry, to the weight loss industry, and I would say not coincidentally, right around the same time, there were 2 new weight loss medications, the first in many years, that were trying to be pushed through the FDA. And this decision from the AMA to classify obesity as a disease increased insurance funding, insurance coverage for these new medications, and also the thought was that they would have more doctors prescribing it if it's a medication to treat a disease versus the connotation of like diet pills. So, I think it just is really misleading because, and this is what I want, one of the reasons it was really important to me to share all of this in the book is that the average person, I think, tends to think that the AMA is a organization designed to, represent the interests of medical doctors. Medical doctors are good people. Medical doctors go into medicine because they want to help people and make people healthier. So if this organization says that obesity is a disease, that must be based on solid research, science, and be in the service of protecting our health. But it's not. They're serving, in many ways, they're serving the interests of the pharmaceutical industry and other big business. And the average person is kind of getting shortchanged there, because what they're deciding is not necessarily in our best interest.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I think you and I have both seen a new article that just came out from a CDC researcher who was harassed for trying to publish data showing that, in fact, longevity wasn't negatively impacted by body size that's classified as "quote unquote" obese. And we also, I worked with FDA for 25 years as a liaison with different biotech companies. So I'm familiar with the FDA advisory committee, for example, that worked on fen-phen, a combination drug product that ended up killing a lot of people before it was taken off the market. And there are two things. One is the people on the advisory board, again, like what you're saying, had deep ties with the pharma industry, the part of the pharma industry that works with diet drugs. And the other thing is that the way they analyzed the risk-benefit analysis that they did made the assumption that being fat was so detrimental that just about any risk was worth taking. So they were willing to overlook some pretty questionable data when they made that approval. And it sounds like those kinds of things are still happening with weight loss drugs.
Yeah, they very much still are. There was a medication, I can't think of the name of it right now, that was taken off the market within the past year or so because of some medical risk. I think it was increased risk of a certain type of cancer. And if you look back into the early studies that the drug company submitted to get FDA approval, those risks were there. And, again, it was this kind of thing of, well, but, almost like it would be better to be dead than to be fat. That the risk, even if it's risking someone's life. And we see this all the time also with the way that people are, the way that bariatric surgery is recommended is like, yes, there's a risk, but you won't be fat anymore. And isn't that the most important thing? I think we recommend all kinds of really dangerous things to fat people and discount not only the medical risk, but also the quality of life. Even if, for example, like a surgery doesn't kill you, there's people who are having, can hardly eat afterwards. They're having lifelong complications.
Yeah. I know someone who had to have her esophagus reconstructed after weight loss surgery. I don't think the risks of those surgeries are sufficiently reported.
Yeah, they're not. And I trained actually in a bariatric surgery clinic and continue and still stay involved with, working with people who've had surgery. And the risks are so underreported going into the surgery. And I think that, again, people are just so eager to, so desperate to grasp at something that will help them lose weight, because in our culture, it is, really hard to live in a bigger body, in a culture that tells you that your body is bad and wrong.
And then one of the paradoxes is that if you diet over and over again, it changes the set point of your body, doesn't it? So that you end up perhaps larger than you would have been.
Yeah. And I think that these are the kinds of things that get discounted when we look at the weight science, right? Like the research on weight and quote unquote obesity. Like these studies don't take it into account the role, we say, oh, well, it's unhealthier to be bigger, but is it unhealthier to be bigger, or is it unhealthy to have lived, a lifetime of dieting and up and down and weight cycling and living, being marginalized and discriminated against, and, the physical impact on that we know from other marginalized groups is really profound. And also not being able to get like adequate medical care. So I think there's so much that's left out of the weight science. And, to be honest, it's surprising in an area that is so highly funded with NIH grants and really top level research people, how sloppy some of the research is, like in terms of not controlling for very basic confounding variables.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that really struck me in your book, which is really related to what we've been talking about in terms of stigmatizing people, is this great quote from Naomi Wolf. She says, "A culture fixated on female thinness is not an obsession about female thinness, but an obsession about female obedience." And of course, recognizing that weight stigma affects all genders, not only women, it does seem like there is an emphasis on women's bodies when we look at things like diet ads, when we look at who's really targeted by the diet industry. And it seems like a place where the personal really is political, isn't it? This is not only a personal issue, not only a medical issue, but also has political implications in terms of human rights and women's rights.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think whenever we talk about the policing of women's bodies, it's a political issue. And research shows that upwards of 90% of women struggle with body image. This is actually interesting. There was a study that looked at, so studies have found that like 91% of women struggle with body image. So just that in and of itself, when we're looking at 90% of a group of people, that's not an individual issue. That's not about my unique struggle with body image. That is a cultural issue where, an entire group of people are being targeted. And, a certain feeling is being induced in terms of not feeling good about your body. An interesting study that I read a while back looked at those 9% of women who didn't feel bad about their bodies to look at what signs of resiliency does this group have, so that we can try to help the other 91% of us. And it was sad. The study actually found that those 9% of people were like holding on by a thread. Maybe they didn't hate their body or hate their size, but they didn't like the way their hair looked. They didn't like something about their facial features. So, it's really like, I'd almost say it's all of us who are struggling with this. And I love Naomi Wolf's quote, because I do think that this is intentional. This is not by accident. Our culture is heavily invested in having women believe that we're not good enough, that that our value comes in what we look like, and then posing this completely unrealistic ideal and saying that if you don't meet this ideal, then there's something wrong with you. And, you have to spend all of your time, money, and energy to try to force yourself into this ideal, which we know you're never going to meet, but spend your whole life trying and failing and feeling like a failure, so that you're too busy to look at what else is happening.
Yeah, and you make a great point in your book about the absurdity of that if somebody built a table for you and it fell apart, and they told you it was your fault that their work fell apart, you might buy it once, but you wouldn't keep going back to that person to build you a bunch of furniture that kept falling apart. And yet the diet industry is built on its own failure, isn't it? It somehow reinforces itself through its own failure. It keeps succeeding over and over again because we believe that the failure of that industry is actually our own personal failure.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest hoax of it all, is that the diet industry has somehow convinced us that like it's our fault that their products don't work. So I hear so many times when I have conversations with people around dieting, and they're like, no, but I did this diet and it did work for me. I lost X amount of weight and I felt really good when I was doing it, and this diet worked. And I'm like, well, what happened? Why are you here now, maybe in my office or whatever. And they're like, well, you know, I got lazy. I just didn't have the discipline. Life got too busy. I wasn't able to stick with it. I need to learn how to try harder. And it's like we blame ourselves for the failure of the plan, even though we know between 81 and 95% of people, dieting will not work long term. It will not, people won't lose weight and keep it off long term. When I say long term, 2 years or more with dieting. And the most likely you will get stuck in that weight cycling pattern. But we don't want to believe it. We somehow are really sold on this idea that like it's our fault that this doesn't work, and that we're the exception to the norm instead of the norm, right? Like that if we just could do it better, all our problems would be solved.
Some great marketing involved there.
Yeah.
And then the other thing about that is, if you think about, somebody saying to you, well, I lost my focus on this program, that means that they probably were doing something more important. They probably were learning French or, raising their children or, any of a number of things that were actually more important, but yet they're blaming themselves for progressing up that hierarchy to something more important.
Right. It's like we shouldn't be living our lives. We should only be focusing, every iota of energy we have on dieting. And actually, when you look at people in what's called the National Weight Control Registry, which is this group of people who have managed to lose weight and keep it off long term. Again, like scientists, it's so unusual that scientists are really interested in studying this small group of people. I think it's only a few thousand people. But what they find is that their life is consumed with maintaining this weight loss, exercising, I think 2 hours a day, every day, counting every calorie, tracking everything. This is their entire life. And if they veer away from it at all, the weight starts to come back on. So, you also have to think from a psychological perspective of like, at what cost are we?
Exactly. We're giving up. People are giving up their lives to this and dedicating their lives to it. And they could be doing something else. So I wanted also to check in with you about advocacy, because I know that's something a lot of people struggle with, is how to, when you get to the point where you have some awareness of some of these issues and you want to live a life that's really more about self-empowerment and less about fixating on dieting. There's so many messages that we still receive from doctors, from colleagues, from friends. And how do we deal with that? I was thinking about, this is going to sound like a total cliche, but oftentimes, at least I think this is true, that when a group of guys gets together for a work lunch, they talk about sports, which is basically a celebration of often the male body. When women get together for a work lunch, they're often talking about, and this I do know from experience, often talking about, oh, this is terrible, I really shouldn't be eating this. In other words, they're sitting together and they're bonding around that and around denigrating the female body. So, how do we navigate that as we start to learn more about the importance of self-acceptance?
I think it's really tricky, because the more that we start to be on our own journey of self-acceptance and recognize diet culture, diet culture is such a baked in part of our culture that it for men like myself, like I didn't see it for many years. I didn't even realize I was living in diet culture. But then once you see it, you really see it, and you hear all the comments that your friends and family are making, and you hear it in a different light, and you hear, I remember for myself when I was first on this journey, just even listening to like the conversations that I would hear around me. I mean,
Mhm.
I live in New York City, so which is like the ultimate eavesdropping, people watching destination. And I love to just like sit and listen to
Yeah.
the conversations around me. Not to be, I hope it's not really creepy, but
Well, you
you know,
can't help it, really.
you can't help it. We're
Yeah,
all
you're all
smushed
jammed
together.
together. Yeah.
But I started to hear so much around even, like mothers and daughters talking
Mhm.
about, oh, we're going to be bad and share this croissant at a coffee shop, or a mother
Mhm.
lamenting. I remember at a, how she needed they were walking past an ad for some kind of um, um, shape sucking in, those things that suck in all
Mhm.
your belly fat,
Yeah.
jeans, and how she needed that for her belly, which was too fat. And you start to hear all of this, and it's really hard, I think, when you're on this journey and the people around you aren't. Because of course it's one thing to overhear a conversation in a coffee shop, it's another when your partner is making these comments, your friends are talking about this,
Mhm.
or you're out at a business lunch and you want to be talking about the, importance of like how to move up in your company or how to make changes. And everyone's just talking about, how much, how bad the French fries are for them.
Mhm.
And I don't think I get asked this a lot of kind of like, what do I say to friends and family and people around me who are still in diet culture? And it's really hard for me to answer because I think it's so unique. And, you know, for myself, as someone within privilege, I think it's a very different experience in terms of like the emotional resources required to speak up in some situations versus someone who's living in a marginalized body who, you know, is already dealing with weight stigma all the time,
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
then have to advocate for themselves and face kind of the scrutiny around their own body,
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
doing that, and saying that they've opted out of diet culture. So I think that it's really important, again, agency here, that we are able to deal with those things the best, what feels best for us. And
Mhm.
if you have the emotional resources to try to educate people and try to like share that you're opting out of diet culture and why diet culture is harmful, I think that that's amazing. Because each person who opts out of diet culture has the potential of reaching other people around them
Mhm.
and sharing, just like that person at that retreat did with me all those years ago, just sharing something very simple that can create a real change in someone's thinking and let them know that there's this other way out there. They don't have to live in that really harmful cycle.
Mhm.
But it's also okay not to do that. It's okay to say, this is too much for me right now. I'm just going to walk away from this conversation. I'm going
Mhm.
to smile and nod. I'm just going to try to survive this and protect myself the best way I can.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. That's really
Mhm.
helpful. Can we haven't talked yet about your your 10-step program, and I wanted to touch on that a little bit, and maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview. I'm sure maybe that's an unfair question because it took a book for you to tell about it, but maybe you could give us a little bit of an outline of it. And also, I'm curious about whether there are certain aspects of it that are more challenging for the folks you work with, because I'm sure you've been using this program in your practice for many years before even writing your book.
Yeah. Yeah, so I can give a brief overview. So there's 10 steps in the program, but I almost think of it as three different phases. The first
Mm-hmm.
is kind of accepting that dieting is not the answer, like this is not the path, and that involves kind of sharing some of the research on like the effectiveness of dieting, also sharing some of the research about health and weight, because as soon as we say that we're opting out of diet culture, or not dieting anymore, the next reaction from people is like, but our health, that's not healthy. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, what we see in the science is that dieting is not healthy. Dieting is not helping us, improve our health. It has a whole bunch of risks and not a lot of benefits. So I thought it was important to kind of spell out the research in a way that,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully is easy to understand and digest. Um, and then once you have kind of, you know, started to step away from diet culture and accepted that dieting isn't the answer, maybe there's something else out there, that frees us up to start to listen to our body more. And that's tricky, right? Because when we've spent a lifetime fighting against our body and believing that our body's bad, that our body's going to lead us astray, that if we, listen to our body, we're just going to sit on the couch and eat donuts 24 hours a day, which is a really common concern I hear when people are starting this process. Like, it's scary to trust that your body will lead you in the right direction. And it really is a leap of faith. So I try to create a very structured program for how people start to listen to your body again, because I think often, even, in the anti-diet community, we hear like, just listen to your body. And yeah, but like, how do I do that? That's what I find a lot of my clients struggle with. That sounds great, but like, how do I do that? Especially when, maybe they feel their body isn't talking to them. Their body doesn't have that internal wisdom. So that's a process that I use a lot. I pull a lot from mindfulness meditation, mindful eating, to try to, in my mind, mindfulness is kind of that, it strengthens the communication between our body and us. So a lot of the times people feel, well, my body's not sending me this wisdom. And really it's just that communication system is disrupted a little bit. Like, it's trying to send us the information, but it's just hard for us to hear it because it's been so many decades of ignoring it. So mindfulness can help us just tune in a little bit better to what our body is telling us. So I go through how to develop a meditation practice, and then also how to start to hear our body, things like hunger, what types of foods we enjoy eating, how certain foods react to with our body, how to make choices around food, how to know what we want to eat. So kind of we go through all of that. And then after that, I talk about understanding our emotional experiences with food a lot, because once we're able to start to hear, like, when we're hungry, when we're not, we may start to notice that there's still times that we want to eat even when we're not hungry, which I think is a completely valid coping mechanism. But I do think it's important to recognize when we're eating for emotional reasons versus when we're eating for physical reasons, mostly because as a psychologist, I think that our emotions are really important. And if we're constantly using food to kind of push away our feelings, then we're not really tending to our emotional needs. So I have a chapter in there about how to manage our feelings, because I think that many of us, really don't have experience with that. We're kind of taught to stuff things away in various ways, and that we're supposed to somehow just like always be okay and feel happy, and those bad feelings just don't exist, or we'll pretend they don't exist. So I go into a bit how to cope with difficult emotional experiences, and what are some other tools that we can add to our toolbox in addition to using food to cope with emotions. And then at the end, I talk about how to, what do we do with our bodies and this extra time and space that we have freed up now from dieting. And part of that is how to connect with our bodies instead of, approaching our bodies from a place of like punishment and self-criticism. How can we connect with our bodies as a source of pleasure? And, both in terms of food, in terms of movement, in terms of sex, how do we start to reclaim that pleasure that diet culture has stolen from us? And then also, what are those things that are most important in our lives? That, what are our values? What are the things that are most meaningful to us? And how can we live most in alignment with those things?
Yeah. Well, it makes perfect sense that if we've spent decades, again, thinking about the Maslow hierarchy, if the diet culture that we've been involved with has kept us trapped, it makes sense that it would be tough to develop other coping mechanisms besides food, because we've been stuck with food all that time.
Exactly.
So it seems like, from what you're saying, like developing more of a variety of experience is important. And as you're saying, looking for what's really meaningful in our lives.
Yeah. And I think that the more that we're able to develop, kind of all the areas of our lives, which, again, diet culture makes it really hard to have that broader view and to also like confirm that we're deserving of pleasure, of rest, of doing things, for ourselves. But what I find, and I hear this a lot in my work, is that people are so drained, right? We're just neglecting ourselves in so many ways in terms of even basic self-care, like getting enough sleep, taking time off from work. Like, I think that Americans in the US, like, I forget what it is, but we have the least amount of vacation time of, all countries. And then most of us don't even take that little bit that we have. We have like the most unused vacation time. So like just taking time to rest and to take care of ourselves. And then when we're so drained and depleted, food does become this very easy kind of way of self-care. Like, it's 9 o'clock at night, I'm exhausted, I'm just going to sit down, turn on the television and, eat this food because it's going to make me feel good. But then which is fine, but it becomes problematic because oftentimes it goes along with this part that actually doesn't feel good. And it's not always nourishing, kind of meeting those deeper needs of what we're wanting. So some of that, tends to just kind of shift as we work towards like having pleasure in other areas of our life, in addition to food. I don't think it's instead of, but in addition to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and exercise is one area where people of size can be stigmatized when they go to the gym, which is absurd. Even from the standpoint of diet culture, you would think that would be celebrated, but yet that's not what happens oftentimes. So, yeah,
it's a lose-lose. You're stigmatized if you don't go to the gym, or you're subject to harassment if you do go. And then people go to the gym and get harassed and then don't want to go back to the gym. And then we say, oh, you're so lazy, you don't want to go back to the gym. We blame people for their own oppression, essentially.
Yeah. So finding fun ways to move our bodies is just such a key thing for this whole process, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it really is. And for many people who have like a history of a conflicted relationship with exercise, this is a very different way to approach things. And, I wrote a little bit about my own experiences in the book in terms of I had always seen exercise as a, something that I had to do because my body was bad. And it was kind of this like punishment for not being good enough. And I would go to the gym and do things that I really didn't enjoy. And it was not it was very far from a pleasurable experience. And it was really this radical idea to start to move in ways that were fun. That wasn't just about like the most, how can I burn the most calories, or what's going to be the most efficient, use of my time. But like this idea that moving can be enjoyable and gentle. I found my way back to exercise and I think I often just say movement because I think exercise can have such a history attached to it for people. But, I found my way back after many years of being, very sedentary. And I was sedentary because I had internalized messages from diet culture that said, if you don't, I think I had like a personal trainer who had once said to me, if you don't go to the gym this many times a week and exercise for this many minutes a day, there's really no point. You're not going to lose weight. You're not going to see the results that you want. So when I started graduate school and I couldn't dedicate my entire life to going to the gym, I said, well, if I can't go that many days a week, why bother? Why even bother? And I stopped going completely. And it wasn't until my body started speaking to me and I, in my mid-20s started having like aches and pains and sciatica and all kinds of other things, which can be caused from a lot of different issues. But movement, coming back to movement at that point in my life really helped just ease my body. And it wasn't about, weight loss at that point. It was about caring for myself and trying to feel my best. And I came back to it through very gentle movement, forms of dance, that were slow and more about self-expression than anything.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting point, that moving our bodies can be for many, many reasons. And weight loss doesn't necessarily have to be even on the list for it to be a good thing to do for ourselves. But yet, you're right, it gets so closely associated with weight loss that if you're not losing weight, you get this comment, what is the point? And there are so many other reasons to be moving our bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think we're getting into the question time.
I think we are too. And this has been fabulous. I really enjoying the conversation, but I want to be sure we're including other folks who might have questions for you. I don't want to hog all that time.
Well, it's been wonderful listening to you talk. I mean, Dr. Constant, you're so knowledgeable. Obviously, you have multiple degrees in these fields, but it's just wonderful to listen to you talk so confidently and with such grace and compassion too about all of your clients and these issues. It's really been wonderful to listen to. I haven't seen any questions come through the chat, so please, people, because we have lots of people here, do post a question in the chat, or you can ask a question. I have a few things that I wanted to ask about while we're waiting to see if anyone is going to speak up. Can you talk a little bit more about how meditation is so important in your program? Because that kind of is a thread throughout the chapters, and I wanted to hear how you think meditation is key to sort of your program.
Yeah, so meditation is I think really a foundation, and it always it kind of cracks me up when I see people who are teaching mindful eating without teaching a mindfulness practice, because mindful eating is inherently couched within mindfulness meditation. And mindfulness, for people who aren't familiar with the idea, is simply about becoming fully aware and present in the current moment. So it's a meditation practice that encourages us to really just be more with ourselves and with the world around us. And I think it's such a powerful tool. We're seeing a lot of research on mindfulness being used for a whole range of different issues. And I think that part of the reason, it's the same meditation, by the way. So a lot of people who, start my program will say, well, I, also using these tools to cope with anxiety or to cope with depression, or, I mean, not as a replacement for therapy, but it's a very, useful tool. And part of the reason that we're seeing it applied to such a range of different topics is that fundamentally it changes not only our relationship with food, but our relationship with ourselves. So mindfulness, is really the tool. It's the method that we can start to reconnect and come back home to ourselves and in our bodies, because that idea of being more present and aware, when we talk about people who struggle with issues around food and body image, so often we're kind of cut off from ourselves and we're eating kind of on autopilot. We're not really being aware of what we're eating, how it feels in our body. Sometimes the experience is just so conflicted that we're like, I just want to eat and get it over with and be done with that. So in my book, I talk about, our inner wisdom, and I call it our internal GPS system, like we might have in a car. It's our navigation system, and that's hardwired into our bodies. And often people say, well, like, that I don't have that in my body because I don't hear my body navigating, guiding me anywhere. And sometimes it's just that the volume on the navigation system is turned down really low. And we're also getting a lot of interference from diet culture that's making it hard for us to hear what our body is telling us. So mindfulness is the tool that helps us like turn up the volume on our body's internal navigation system and just better hear what our body is telling us in terms of guiding us with our eating, and also emotionally to be more in tune with what's happening emotionally in our lives. So I think it's a really profound part of the experience, and it also ties in with a practice of self-acceptance and increased self-compassion, which are really important parts of the journey as well, because when we are caught in hating ourselves, we it's hard to get anywhere.
Thanks for that. I also wanted to ask about your internal GPS. So I'm glad you touched on that and that question. And now we have a few questions that have been posted. So I'm going to ask from the audience. Can you talk about how to talk to your kids or don't talk to them about diet culture? How do you teach skills to resist the influence of diet culture and anti-fatness at a young age?
So I'll start with the disclaimer that I am not a child therapist. I don't work with kids, but I do think that the most important thing that we can do for our children in terms of helping them develop a healthy relationship with food and their body is to model that for them. So I keep another research study. I'm a bit of a research buff, but there's another study that showed that actually the most important factor for how a child will feel about their body is how a parent feels about their own body, and that persisted into adulthood for children. So even as children became adults, they were strongly influenced by how their parents felt about their own bodies. So, I think that I hear, often we want, it's not always the answer that we want to hear. Sometimes you want to, like, what can I tell my kid to do where I don't have to work on this so much for myself? But kids hear and see what we're doing. And if we are dieting, if we're restricting our eating, if we're afraid of certain foods, even if we think that's not filtering down to our kids, it is. Like, they see it, they know. So, I would worry less about what your kids are eating and monitoring that as much as having a healthy relationship with food in the home, I think will go a really long way. There are specific books though on child feeding. Many people recommend Ellen Sattler's work on division of responsibility. Virginia Smith, I think, writes on this. I know she writes on this as well. So there are resources available if you want more specific, info for kids, but I think healing ourselves will go a really long way.
You hear it. That sounds great. Another question is, does something like Weight Watchers count as part of being diet culture? They seem to be trying to talk about wellness along with nutrition, though there is advertising and sustainability issues.
Yeah, so diet culture is sneaky. And one of the things that we've seen is that as people have gotten, people generally have gotten more savvy to the idea that diets don't work, and the diet companies have shape-shifted. So diet companies have kind of started rebranding as wellness, and Weight Watchers is one of the most well-known examples. And I actually talk about that a little bit in my book, that, and there was an article a few years ago in the New York Times that talked about this as well. I think it was around, I don't know, there was a certain time where body positivity started becoming more popular, and Weight Watchers stock took a nosedive. It was right around the time Oprah came in too. And their research team said people have dieting fatigue. People know that this doesn't work. And what are we going to do? We have to rebrand. So they became WW, which no one knows what it stands for, including the company. But they didn't want to be associated with a weight loss diet anymore because that's not popular. But essentially, it's the same thing. It's a diet. Whether you're counting points or calories doesn't really matter. Whether they tell you can have, bread, as Oprah famously says in her commercial, or, whatever foods you want, it's still a diet. And statistically speaking, it's, doesn't have great long-term results for the vast majority of people. Now, there will be some people who have a, good effect from it, and that will be a very, very vocal minority. That 5% of people who have long-term success with dieting want to talk about it all the time in every setting. We also hear a lot from people in that kind of honeymoon phase of, this diet is great. I've been doing it for 4 weeks and I feel so awesome. Or I've been staying on this for 6 months and I feel the best I've ever felt. But the question is not whether people can lose weight or stay on a diet for a short period of time. It's really what happens over, a 2-year and longer period, because that's where we see, if we look at the data charts, that's where we see people lose and then regain, and usually end up a little bit higher even than where they started. So I would definitely consider Weight Watchers to be part of diet culture. They're a big spearheader of it, but it's really confusing with the marketing. I've seen Noom, which is another diet company. Please don't Google it, but they. Their advertising is all about that they are anti-diet. And I have a lot of even clients who work with me who say, this seems really similar to the work that we're doing. And then, if people sign up, it's low calorie, calorie counting, good old fashioned diet.
Marketing.
Yeah. They have great marketing. The diet culture has good marketing.
I've got one final question in here, and then we'll do our raffle. Do you suggest a particular guided meditation or program for mindfulness?
So if you buy the book, I do have some meditations that you can download that are designed to be used along with the program. But I also think there's a lot of good apps out there. I personally am a fan of Insight Timer. It's a free, I think it's either free or like $1.99, something like that. But I like that app a lot. It has a lot of different meditations on there of varying quality. So you have to kind of know how to navigate it a little bit. But I think meditations that focus on being more present and aware are important. A lot of things get kind of put into the mindfulness category that aren't really mindfulness. So meditations that are for relaxation or guided imagery, or that are, designed to like imagine you're on a beautiful island somewhere and feeling relaxed. That's not really mindfulness, because mindfulness is about tuning into what is actually happening right now and being present instead of tuning out and kind of going somewhere else. But, I think that there's so many great apps out there. It's mindfulness has become so popular that there's a lot of good stuff out there. Insight Timer is the one personally that I use. I have no financial connection with them, but maybe they should sponsor me.
Great. Well, we're going to run a raffle now for a $30 Flyleaf gift card, sponsored by North Atlantic Books, the publisher of this book. So right now, I think what I'll do is I'm going to let you, Alexis, choose a number between 1 and 14, and then I'm going to call out who the winner of the raffle is.
All right, let's go with 7.
7. Okay, this goes to Brianna. So I will get Brianna's details from our participant list, and I will send you. You've won this gift of Flyleaf. If you are not local, you can access. You can shop online, and we can send you your books just fine from the store. So I'll be in touch with Brianna after the event. So congratulations on winning our gift card. I'd like to extend a few reminders. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Alexis or Stella's books, they are available on our website. And if you missed some of our conversation tonight, or if you'd like to share it with a friend, you can find it recorded on this Crowdcast platform. And finally, please keep an eye out for other upcoming events in our weekly newsletter and on our website. We've got some great programs coming up online. And just last week and this week, we're starting some in-person hybrid events. So that is a new world for us. So we're letting people back in this event space, and we're going to see how that goes in the coming months. Thank you both so much for joining us. This was a really, really great event, and please come by Flyleaf and buy the book. It's a really great read, and very, very fun to read, and just really thoughtful. And yeah, it's a great time tonight. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
Really
thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.